Hello. I'm going to talk to you guys today about academic plagiarism compared to plagiarism within the pulpit while giving a sermon. Academic plagiarism is essentially an act of using anyone's work in a college or high school paper in which you do not cite. Um, if you're using someone else's work within a paper, you should always cite this. If you do not, then you are falling into plagiarism and thus could either fail that particular assignment or even be expelled from school. Now, when it comes to plagiarism within the pulpit, this is something a little bit tougher to define, mainly because as a preacher, they all use the Bible. Um, and we essentially all glean from the Bible messages that can be very similar to each other. Now, while doing a sermon, it is best to follow the guidelines of if you're using someone else's work for the basis of your sermon, to give them credit for that. If you are using someone's idea yet rearranging it to work within the sermon, you could also give them credit, but it's not necessarily a must. If you're using direct points or a list or something of that nature, always give that person credit. The biggest problem is that at times we can all come up with the same exact message or something very similar in the form of our messages. And this is why it makes it so tough for a preacher to kind of guide his way through the plagiarism minefield. So the best bet is to cite your sources. If your church has like an overhead where you have a screen and stuff, you could put it up on a slide or something, or you could directly say it, but at the same time, you don't want to take away from your message. And if you're citing within your sermon too often, then you're taking away from the message that you're trying to convey by making it look like you've essentially went out and just done a bunch of research and not truly allowed God to direct you in the way that He wanted you to, or in the way that you should have prepared the sermon. It's also important when preparing a sermon to give good information. There's a lot of times that we pull stuff from our own lives or from uh, friends' lives, families' lives that we can use within our sermons to help nail down certain points. I know for me, when I'm preaching, I like to use my own personal life experiences or something that may have happened during the week that I noticed or something along that nature. And in regards to that, even if it's not something that technically happened to you, but something that you may have heard about from a friend, you really would not have to cite that type of situation because that would be kind of one of those tough things to cite. It essentially comes down to whether or not what you're doing is general knowledge or not. And that's basically the same way for an academic paper. If it's general knowledge, then pretty much everybody knows about it, so you really don't have to cite those things. Now, it is important to remember while giving your sermon that anything that you cite needs to fit within the parameters of what you're speaking of. For instance, a few weeks ago, I gave a sermon on the idea of Jesus being a rebel in regards to how he talked with the Pharisees about some of his sayings that kind of expounded on the Ten Commandments and things like that. And within it, I used some lyrics from a song that I like, and I made sure that I cited that. However, further on in that, I also showed how Jesus, not only was a rebel in that sense, but also how we at times are rebellious, but for this very wrong reasons. I gave specific points from my life in which I have done the same, in which I did not have to cite. So, just when you're doing a sermon, make sure that you give people the proper credit that they deserve if you are using their material, as well as if you're using a basis of their material to get your message, you should also use citations for that. And it just make sure that you walk that fine line so that everybody gets their credit. Because ultimately, especially within a sermon, if we are not giving credit to those who did it, then we're essentially being hypocritical because we are stealing someone else's work. And of course, the Bible says, "Thou shalt not steal." Thank you, and have a great day, guys.